Was the Civil War about slavery? When you fight and you combat neo-Confederates and Confederate sympathizers, one of the things you hear a lot is that the Civil War was not about slavery. And they go into this long argument about states' rights and secession and the Constitution, all of this. And I wanted to make a multi-part video series dissecting this because I take a very different approach than many people who stand on the same side that I do, which is anti-Confederate worship. I tend to agree with a lot of the Confederate sympathizers here, but I make this point that I say the Civil War was not about slavery because we were too racist in the North and the South for it to be about ending slavery. Did it eventually become about ending slavery? Yes, and we'll discuss that in one of these video segments. But when you look back at it, you talk about the war over the southern states seceding. There is a lot of arguments to be made, but my biggest point is it doesn't matter, because when it gets down to the foundation, the Civil War and all of the problems we experienced from the early republic through the antebellum period was because of America's original sin. It was because of white supremacy, racism, and slavery. And I'm going to try and not to be hyperbolic here in a lot of the statements that I make. And I also try not to give my opinion in most of my videos, but you'll see my opinion come out a lot in this video series because I believe that America's original sin, slavery, ruined, in my opinion, what could have been potentially the greatest republic in human history. We talk about the cause of the Civil War, and we go all the way back to the Constitution. The Constitution was a flawed and corrupted document because of slavery and white supremacy. And because of that, from 1787, when the Constitution was written, until the antebellum period, until the Civil War, it was the reason for the secession of the 11 southern states and the war that would follow. So when I say that I agree with Confederate sympathizers that the war wasn't about slavery, I say, of course, I agree, but for very different reasons. And I point back to the fact that, however, slavery was the foundation for all of these troubles and all of this problem. And of course, since slavery was based in white supremacy, there you have it, right? So in order to understand this and to really get a grasp of why the southern states seceded, what they believed, and to tie this all into white supremacy and slavery, we have to go back to before the Constitution was written. So today's video is going to be about the concept of state sovereignty as understood by the 13 colonies through the Articles of Confederation and eventually through the Constitution itself. So we got to go back to before the Revolution. So not to speak hyperbolically, not to speak in absolutes, when I say the founders said or the founders believed, of course, not all of the founders said or believed said things. When we get to the Constitutional Convention, you'll, and forgive me, I'm still getting over this COVID, you'll hear about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and they each got some wins. They each got some of what they wanted. So there wasn't this one united idea or concept, but there were things that pervaded and went through all of their ideas or understandings of what the states were and what they brought to the table. So if we go back to the American Revolution, there's no doubt in my mind that at the time of the American Revolution, the colonists believed that each colony was fighting for its own separate independence. While they did come together for a united goal, that is to beat England or to be free from England, they understood that they were separate, sovereign, united entities. The Declaration of Independence says, quote, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." So while the Declaration does say united colonies, it makes the point to say independent states. So the term independent states, plural states, actually appears 3 times in the Declaration of Independence's conclusion. So it really left no doubt as to its meaning. The colonies would be united in this cause of defeating England and breaking their political ties with Great Britain, but in reality, they were striving for their own separate independence. The end of the American Revolution came with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, the treaty declared, and I love the way some of these treaties are written, His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States. It then goes on to list all of them: New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, etc. But it says, recognize them to be free, sovereign, and independent states. So after the war, each state's independence and sovereignty was confirmed by the treaty that ended the war and was later substantiated and confirmed under the Articles of Confederation, which was the first government of the United States. The Articles of Confederation referred to itself as a, quote, firm league of friendship, and it only gave the national government, right, minimal powers in specific areas of interest to all of the states. And these were areas of common defense, the security of the states' liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. Section 2 of the Articles of Confederation said, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. So, going into the Constitutional Convention, each state believed, and was right in believing, in their own independence and sovereignty. And I believe that this is what has to be understood for us to make sense of what would develop into this idea of states' rights. For the most part, again, I don't like to speak in absolutes because not everyone held the same idea. There were Federalists who came into this convention who may have believed in state sovereignty and state independence, but wanted to severely limit that and have a strong national government. But for the most part, the delegates, when they assembled at the convention, they understood they didn't represent a people of the United States en masse. Instead, they represented the citizens of the sovereign states themselves. They entered the convention fully understanding that they represented these states that were united in a compact where each state retained its sovereignty and independence. That was the Articles of Confederation, and that's what they're coming into as representatives of these states and of the people of these states at the Constitutional Convention. So the delegates were actually tasked with amending the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly realized that a more drastic change was necessary to ensure the long-term survival of this new nation. For this new government to work, the delegates understood that the states would have to give more concessions. They'd have to give up more of their sovereignty to empower a federal government. But many of these states, and many of the delegates from the states, were never willing to relinquish sovereignty of the independent states, not entirely. So the new form of government that they created, and if you go through James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, you'll see that the Federalists who wanted this strong national government and the Anti-Federalists who wanted to retain power with the states and state sovereignty, they argued and bickered over this. And concessions had to be made. For example, the word national, every time it was written in a draft of the Constitution, was replaced with the word federal to appease the Anti-Federalists, because a national government has this idea of a controlling entity above the states, whereas federal, this idea of this federal coming together, even though it's confusing with Federalist and Anti-Federalist, using the word federal actually appeased the Anti-Federalist, who didn't want the term national because that would take away too much of the sovereignty of the states in their minds. So they knew that they would have to concede some areas, and they would have to make a national government, and they would term it as a federal government, that would have more power than under the Articles of Confederation, but still protect the state's sovereignty and independence. So James Madison explained this new idea for the government at the Virginia Convention when he said, quote, "The powers of the general government relate to external objects and are but few, but the powers in the states relate to those great objects which immediately concern the prosperity of the people." This is important. What he was saying is, under this new constitution, the states still remain sovereign and independent, but they delegated some aspects of that sovereignty to a federal government, which would act in areas of common concern to all of the states, and this would become national security, regulating interstate commerce to have an effective economy, because prior to the Constitution, the states were bickering amongst themselves and fighting amongst themselves, doing economic protectionism. So areas of their sovereignty, of the state's sovereignty, was delegated to the federal government, was given to the federal government in the Constitution in these areas of common interest, while everything else, what you would consider the police powers of the state, health, welfare, safety, things that cultural differences play a lot on, were left to the states themselves. So they would argue that there was never one united American people in the aggregate, right? There was no "we the people of the United States." But then you'll say, "Hey, professor, but what about the preamble of the Constitution?" Well, we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, was not the original draft of the Constitution. The original draft said, "we the people of the states of," and then listed out all 13 states. The problem came with when they got to Article 7 of the Constitution. Article 7 stated, quote, "The ratification of the Convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same," end quote. So what happens is, according to Article 7, once 9 of 13 states ratified the Constitution, it became effective among them. Any state after 9 that refused to ratify the Constitution and may never ratify the Constitution would exist outside of the compact as a completely sovereign, independent country. So they could not write "we the people of" and enlist all of the states, because they weren't sure that all of the states would ratify it. So changing it to "we the people of the United States" was not a hint at saying they believed in one united American people in the aggregate. It was a stylistic change because they realized that not every state might ratify the Constitution. So James Madison even talks about this. In the Virginia Ratification Convention and in Federalist number 39, he was trying to calm people down, saying that if the framers had intended to create one united American people and not simply 13 sovereign independent states that delegated some of their sovereignty to a federal government, then it would have required a majority of the population for the Constitution to be ratified and to become effective amongst all 13 states. In Federalist 39, he writes, James Madison writes, quote, "that it will be a federal, not a national act, as these terms are understood by the objectors, the act of the people as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from this single consideration, that it is to result neither from the decision of the majority of the people of the Union, nor from that a majority of the states. It must result from the unanimous assent of the several states that are parties to it. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only bound by its own voluntary act," end quote. So, in its sovereign capacity, each state called a ratification convention with delegates chosen by the state's people to decide whether to adopt this Constitution. The ratification ordinances from each of these states show how clearly they truly understood that each state would retain its sovereignty and its ability to reclaim, to reassume any power delegated to the federal government if the federal government should ever abuse that grant, right? So now we're getting into, where did the 11 southern states believe in this concept of secession and leaving the union or reassuming the powers delegated to the federal government? South Carolina's ordinance of ratification stated that, quote, "no section or paragraph of the said Constitution warrants a construction that the states do not retain every power not expressly relinquished by them and vested in the general government of the Union," end quote. New York's ordinance of ratification, this is a very telling one, said, quote, "that the powers of the government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, that every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments of the government thereof remains to the people of the several states or to their respective state governments." So New York was even saying, we delegate these powers to the federal government. Whatever powers that are not delegated to the federal government are retained for the state governments and for the people of those states to decide how the states will use them. And if the federal government, the agent acting on behalf of all of us, should abuse those powers, the states can reassume it, meaning take those powers back. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, trying to calm the fears of the states' rights activists and many of the people who were concerned about the Constitution, the federal government, actually believed, he wrote and he said, I ask, what are these principles? So, quote, I ask, what are these principles? Do they require that in the establishment of the Constitution, the states should be regarded as distinct and independent sovereigns? They are so regarded by the Constitution proposed, end quote. So James Madison even believed that the states were still sovereign, independent entities that only delegated some aspects of their sovereignty to a federal government. A much stronger federal government than under the Articles of Confederation, but still, the states retained ultimate sovereignty, the states and the people of those states. North Carolina, see, some of the states, and this is really the anti-federalist pushing, would not ratify the Constitution unless there was a 10th Amendment, Bill of Rights, but clearly a 10th Amendment to the Constitution that protected the power of the states and the sovereignty of the states. North Carolina proposed that, quote, each state in the Union shall respectively retain every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Constitution delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of the general government. That was their proposed 10th Amendment. Rhode Island, in fact, refused ratification until, quote, Congress shall guarantee to every state its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Constitution expressly delegated to the United States, end quote. So it might seem obvious as you read the Constitution that the federal government would only have the powers that are delegated to it in the Constitution, which were those powers relinquished by the states. But still, through the 10th Amendment, the states wanted to solidify forever that the functions of the general government of the United States were strictly limited to the powers delegated to it in the Constitution, with the states retaining all other powers. So, to what would eventually become the Confederate States of America, the secessionists, that group, they believed that sovereignty that was not delegated to the federal government or denied by the Constitution to the states was still forever a reserved power of the state governments. And one of those powers was the right to reassume all of their sovereignty and to leave the Union. And that's the end of what we're going to discuss today. I just wanted you to get a brief understanding of really the anti-federalist position, what they believed from the Constitution, from the Revolution to the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, what they saw as state sovereignty, and how they truly believed that the states never gave up their sovereignty and their independence. And I will tell you, and again, this is my own personal opinion, the idea, and this is going to get into the next lesson, but just to cover it briefly, for those of you who don't know, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. The Bill of Rights did not become mandatory on the states until the 14th Amendment through the incorporation doctrine. And we'll cover that in the next lesson. But why didn't the Bill of Rights apply to the states? The Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states because the framers, all of the framers understood that every right could be limited. Every right can be limited. They were not concerned about the limitation of rights. They were concerned about what level of government would have the authority to limit those rights. And to them, a federal government or a national government that had power and authority over millions of people could never effectively regulate those rights the way the people wanted because of so many different cultures and groups that lived within this republic. So their answer was to limit the power of the federal government and to allow the states complete control of their domestic affairs. Now, I kind of tell this story jokingly, but when I got married 2 years ago, my best New York friend, who is an assistant district attorney in New York City, he came down to Louisiana for my wedding, and he was sitting across from my best Louisiana friend. And my New York friend looks at my Louisiana friend and says, "How many guns do you own?" My Louisiana friend looks at my New York friend and says, "You don't ask a man that question." And I laughed. They were completely civil. It was a great conversation. But I laughed because this was what the framers were talking about, or at least the framers who believed in state sovereignty and the inability of a national government to effectively regulate the cultures of the different peoples of different states. Prior to the 14th Amendment, if New York wanted to completely ban gun ownership, it could do so regardless of the Second Amendment. It didn't matter. If that's the will of the people of New York, then they were allowed to do it and could do it. Whereas in Louisiana, forgive me again, in Louisiana, if our people and the citizens of this state decide that guns are so important that there should be no limits on guns, then that was the purview and the right of the people of the states. The framers believed that the local governments would never abuse the rights of the citizens because of how close local governments were to the people. Whereas I may not be able to go out and have a conversation with President Trump, I can probably have a conversation with my governor or my local state representatives or state senators. So it's not that the framers were against limiting rights. They believed in limiting rights. They wanted to make sure the correct level of government was limiting said rights. Now, I think that's a great idea. And I actually think a country of small republics united under a federal government that is limited to areas of national interest, I think it's a great form of government. I think it would have been the greatest form of government, the greatest form of republic in human history. Where it failed, what we'll get into, is racism and white supremacy. Because what was the number one domestic issue, the cultural difference between the states that the antebellum, what would become the antebellum slaveholding states were trying to defend and protect? The rights to own slaves, the foundational laws of white supremacy. And one of the main reasons for the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine was that after the 13th Amendment, when slavery ended and you now had free black people in the United States, what was the first thing that states tried to limit? The rights of those black people in the states. So the right to keep and bear arms, all the search and seizures, fair trials, all of that. So the federal government the 14th Amendment had to make the Bill of Rights apply to the states to protect the rights of all citizens. So when I go back and I say that slavery and racism and white supremacy ruined everything, it truly did. Because slavery existed in the Constitution and slaves were a protected species of property in the Constitution was doomed to fail from the day that it was ratified. And that's what we're going to get into. So this argument that a lot of pro-Confederates make about the Civil War and it wasn't about slavery, you're right, it wasn't, because we were too racist for it to be about slavery. But secession absolutely was about slavery. And secession, as you can see, was believed to be legal through the Constitution and through the early Republic. And because the Constitution ingrained in it, the right to own human beings as property, it protected the species of property of slaves, that it was doomed to fail from the beginning. So we'll get into the next lesson, but for today I just wanted you to see what the antebellum slaveholding states believe was their right as sovereign states. We'll get into secession, nullification, all of that later, and why they actually seceded in the next lesson, which hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, slavery, and then we'll get into the Civil War in the third video. So as always, remember, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next one.